Good morning, Bucknutters. Welcome to the Bucknuts Morning 5 here on Monday, November 14th, 2016. I am Dave Biddle, happy as always to be joined by Brandon Castel. BCast, if Ohio State moves up to number 2 in the college football playoff rankings as expected tomorrow, then they go on to beat Michigan State and Michigan, but they don't play in the Big Ten championship game due to the tiebreaker with Penn State. Do you think the Buckeyes will make the playoffs with an 11-1 record and no Big Ten title?
Man, I mean, it's crazy to think we're in this spot. You know, you always think that it's going to fix itself by the end of the year, that everything will shake out, and the teams that deserve to kind of be in there now that we've got this 14 playoff platform, and you know, you could argue that it might make more sense in this case to have an 18 playoff, but it is what it is right now. And you know, it's interesting that they're in that position, and also interesting to think that Louisville could be in a similar position going into kind of that final decision by the playoff committee. I do think that Ohio State has a very good shot to get in, even if they don't go to play in the Big Ten championship. But the one thing that's holding them back from me saying, yes, I think they're basically an automatic in, is so far, you know, we've only had 2 years of this, but every team that's played in the college football playoff thus far has been a conference champion. So we got to look back at what the committee has done, and they have seemed to reward conference champions. But they've also said, our goal is to find the 4 best teams in college football. And so I think if you end up in this situation at the end of the year, you know, Ohio State, in my mind, is one of those 4 best teams, or at least they will be if they go out and take care of business against Michigan State and Michigan. So it's going to be incredibly tough for the committee to leave them out. I don't think this is quite the same as leaving out, you know, go back a couple of years and leaving out the Big 12 because they didn't have a conference championship game. I do look at this a little different, but it'll be interesting to see how the committee views it.
Yeah, you brought up the Big 12 a couple of years ago. I'm glad you did. A lot of people will, you know, bring that up when refuting what you just said and refuting, because I agree with you. I think if Ohio State moves up to number 2 and then they win out, how are they going to drop to number 5? I could see, you know, a team or 2 jumping them. I can't see 3 teams jumping them if they move up to number 2 and then they beat Michigan State and Michigan. I just can't see that. And people will compare it to TCU and Baylor 2 years ago. Well, TCU and Baylor were never number 2 and then got jumped by 3 teams and then fell out. You know, they were 4 and 5 entering that final week, and then Ohio State jumped them. So to me, that is completely different. Furthermore, let's just be real. The committee would never admit this, but Ohio State brings in so much more money than a school like TCU or a school like Baylor or a school like name it. I think that plays a factor too. So, you know, short story long, if the Buckeyes move up to number 2, which I think they will tomorrow, they did in the AP poll and the coaches poll yesterday, I think they're sitting pretty good. It still is a little, you'd rather be a Big Ten champs like you're saying. It's still, you know, it's still not the best feeling, but I just can't imagine how they're going to be number 2 and then win out and then fall to number 5.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, and I think you got to look across. Again, it's weird how much can change in a couple weeks, so obviously we'll be having this conversation again. But, you know, I think you look across the college football landscape, and, you know, to me, Washington's loss to USC at home on Saturday was a big factor in all this because, you know, obviously if they won out, they were going to be in the college football playoff. But with that loss, I look around at you know, the Pac-12, the Big 12. Again, not to discredit their chances of having a conference championship or having a conference champion get into the college football playoff. But, you know, I think you could make a case now for the committee to say, well, the top team in the Big 12, you know, at least at the moment, is a team in Oklahoma that Ohio State beat on its own field earlier in the season. The top team in the Pac-12 is a team that just lost at home to USC in a game they scored 13 points. Now, you know, again, they do have wins over Stanford and Utah, and they may go on to win the Pac-12, and that'll be a decision the committee has to make. But I think it cracked the door to say, at the end of the season, we're in such a strange year, which, you know, probably happen every couple years in college football, the way that it always plays out. We're in such a strange year where, you know, you could argue that 2 teams from the ACC or 2 teams from the Big Ten give you a better 4-team playoff or have a better chance of having the top 4 teams in the country than forcing a Big 12 champion or a Pac-12 championship, Pac-12 champion into the playoff.
Switching gears from the playoff, because like you mentioned, we're going to talk about that probably, you know, every day, 10 times a day until the final rankings come out. I want to talk about true freshmen and redshirt freshmen on the current team for the Buckeyes that might not get a chance to play a lot. So we're not talking about like Nick Bosa. We're not talking about Michael Jordan, guys like that. But guys that usually get in there in the fourth quarter and you're like, wow, like DeMario McCall, Joe Burrow, Just talk about some guys, that have really impressed you and why they've impressed you as far as that true freshman and redshirt freshman class.
Yeah, I mean, there are a bunch of guys I think that have come along this year to a point now where you can start to see, what they could become. I mean, I think DeMario McCall is obviously the one that jumps out to me because, whenever you see a young guy who's able to get on the field, touch the football and make an impact, be a guy that when he gets in there, there's some excitement and you feel confident that he can go out and make a play. I mean, I think that's a big deal. You don't expect a guy like that to, really be included that much in the offense because typically you've got older guys who they trust more with the football. You've got older guys you've got to get the football to, Curtis Samuel, Mike Weber, some of those other guys. But I mean, every time DeMario McCall gets on the field, he makes plays. And you go back to even this week, over 100 yards of offense and a touchdown, in some pretty limited opportunities to get on the field, touched the ball 16 times on offense. And, I think he's a kid that's going to really grow into a really big role on this football team, whether that's next year or the year after. I see a really bright future for him that I didn't necessarily see coming into the year. Not necessarily that I didn't think he had talent. I just didn't expect him to jump in and be such a big factor this early in the season. Another guy, obviously we saw him make a big play on Saturday, but another guy that I really like, is Ben Victor. I've been talking about him for a little while. I know we saw him way back in camp and thought, man, this kid has the look. He's got the height, he's got the length, seemed to have the athleticism and ability. But obviously he needed to put on some weight and he was kind of buried behind some of the other older guys like, Corey Smith and Johnny Dixon and James Clark. Well, I think we're at the point now we can say, he's kind of beyond those guys. I mean, still think Paris Campbell is going to be a major factor, in the receiving. And I really like KJ Hill. I think KJ Hill's a guy that, can really emerge from this receiver group to become kind of a staple for this team. I think KJ Hill is one of those young guys that, that really, I think, the injury last year set him back a little bit, but I think we're starting to see what KJ Hill can bring to the table. So those are two guys, that I like a lot. I mean, I think another guy that we talk about and has played a little bit this year, but I'm really a big fan of what I've seen from Robert Landers. He just always seems to be around the football at a position that they really, really needed some guys to come on. So, I think there's a lot of guys we could run down and say, that have a bright future. There's a ton of talent on this football team, but, those are a couple guys that I've seen the last couple weeks that really, I think not only look good, but, have a chance to be impact players on this football team as early as next season.
Ohio State has won 2 consecutive games by a score of 62-3, which is pretty amazing, especially considering one of them was ranked 10th at the time in Nebraska. I don't think they're going to win 62-3 this week, Brandon, but they are favored by 23.5 points at Michigan State. What do you expect will happen this Saturday in East Lansing?
Yeah, it's very interesting because they're obviously rolling. I think you could write off maybe the Maryland game as an anomaly if they hadn't just come off a big win over number 10 Nebraska or then number 10 Nebraska, at 62-3 as well. So I do think they're starting. I lean more towards, this team starting to find its stride and really starting to turn the corner. They recognize they're in November. Urban usually has these guys ready to play by this time in the year. So I tend to lean more towards that than to say, all right, well, they beat a maybe not so good, team this last week in Maryland. And it's weird to be talking about, think about where we would have been the last couple of years with Michigan State. I mean, yeah, if you were going into this game, back-to-back games against Michigan State and Michigan, all the focus would be on Michigan State. And we'll deal with Michigan when we get there. But Michigan State has been such a battle for them, really since Urban Meyer got to Ohio State, that it's weird to go into this game assuming that, that Ohio State's just going to come in and roll through the Spartans on their own field. But, I mean, they did. I know Michigan State's coming off that big 49-0 win over Rutgers, but before that, I mean, they had lost 7 games in a row. I mean, you had to go back to that Notre Dame game to find a victory on their schedule, and some of them weren't even that close. They lost to Maryland. I mean, 28-17, they lost to Maryland. They lost by 2 touchdowns to Northwestern. They lost by 3 scores to BYU. They weren't even close against Wisconsin. They lost at Illinois 31-27, so something I never thought I would hear myself say about a Mark D'Antonio team. But I go back to that Michigan game. They lost 32-23, but they were in that game. Now, it looked like Michigan might be able to roll and blow them out, early, but they stayed in that game and made that a game and really gave Michigan more of a fight than I think what people thought, because there's still some guys in that locker room that can play. There's still a lot of pride on that football team. And I think D'Antonio will have his team ready to play again these next 2 weeks against Ohio State and Penn State. Now, I don't think that means they're going to come out and really push Ohio State to the brink, but I do think it means Ohio State's not going to come out and go, 49-0 or 62-3 against Michigan State. I expect them to battle, and I think Ohio State will have to play a good game if they're going to win this thing handedly.
Urban Meyer press conference today, 11:45 a.m. as usual, each Monday. What's a question or questions you really want to hear Coach Meyer answer today?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff that I think you could touch on. One thing I would love to hear, just because we were talking about the college football playoff and where that's at and how it could play out with Ohio State maybe getting left out of the Big Ten championship game if the chips fall that way. I don't know if he's been asked recently, but I'd love to hear his thoughts on, whether he thinks that the 4 teams in the college football playoff should be conference champs. I mean, I think there's a chance to get a guy on the record, not that you're trying to get everyone to come out and make an official statement, but I think it's interesting to find out which coaches stand firmly on, yes, you should be a conference champ, and which ones kind of fall on we just want the 4 best teams in, and some may be in between, but I'd love to hear, where he's at with that right now. And then the other thing, I'd love to hear is just his thoughts on a team like Michigan State. When you've had a year like Michigan State has had, and he's so familiar with what D'Antonio and the Spartans have done the last few years, the battles they've given. Nobody has played him harder. No one has been more of a tough out for Ohio State in the last, 4 or 5 years than Michigan State. So I'd love to hear, him talk about what went wrong. And I don't know if he can really pinpoint that. He probably hasn't studied them that well. But as he looks at the film and starts to look at, where they've gone off the rails a little bit, what has he seen? And, what does that mean for a team, when you're used to winning at a high level and you're coming into these big games now? They've got a chance to reshape the entire college football landscape playing Ohio State and Penn State the next 2 weeks. So, if you're that kind of team, what are you thinking? Where do you get that oomph to come out and play these games and be competitive after stumbling through so much of the season? So that'd kind of be my most interesting takeaway, is if you can get Urban to open up about any of those topics.
Great insights, as always, from Brandon Castel. Thank you very much, BCast, and thanks to all the listeners out there for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Hope everyone has a great day. Let's hear some Buckeye swag, best damn band in the land.